what we have in the female reproductive system in terms of the organs are some things that are similar to what you would find in what we talked about in the male reproductive system, but also some organs that don't have an equivalent. But the ovaries are one that does. So the ovaries in a woman are much like the testes are in a man. They perform two important functions that are basically the same in men and women. So what do you think those two functions would be? Two things, what do the testes do? Testosterone and sperm cells. Okay, so it's not going to, the ovaries don't produce testosterone and sperm cells, but they do produce
Estrogen and eggs.
yeah, the female sex hormone, which is estrogen, and the female gamete or sex cell, which is an egg cell. So that's where we have some equivalence. So also the female has two ovaries, a left and a right ovary, just like the man has two testes. And they hold the eggs and they produce estrogen. Now you'll notice I used a different term here. In the testes, we said testes produce sperm cells. And in ovary, I said holds egg cells. This is because there's an important difference in men and women. So as I was just explaining, men produce millions of sperm cells every day. Things are different in a woman. Inside of the ovaries, all of the egg cells that she ever has are present in her ovaries from the time of birth. And she will never make any new egg cells. Okay. So in the ovary, the egg cells are in an immature stage. Once puberty starts, then one of those immature eggs, every reproductive cycle, every month or so, will start to grow and mature and be released. But only a single egg cell, or maybe two or three, depends on the situation, will be released each reproductive cycle. And so that's much different than in men. Okay, men produce millions of sperm cells, always creating new ones. Women have all the eggs, so they're already there in the ovaries. They just develop and mature once puberty comes. Estrogen is the female sex hormone. So as we talked about in the endocrine system, controls secondary female sex characteristics. So attached to the ovaries, or I guess I shouldn't really say that, because they're not physically attached. So the vas deferens is actually attached to the testes. In the ovaries is sort of a round organ, and the next part, the oviduct or fallopian tube, is actually sort of near it, but not physically connected. Okay? So that's a little bit different. The fallopian tube, or also it's called the oviduct. There's one on each side, obviously. Here's one, here's one. The fallopian tube carries the egg cells that are released, okay, and transports them. Just like, so this is equivalent to what in the male?
Vas deferens.
Yeah, like the vas deferens, which transports sperm cells. The fallopian tubes carry the egg cells. The uterus is this central organ in the female reproductive system. It does not have like an equivalent in a male. It's a muscle. It's a pouch-like muscle that can expand significantly and contract down to a smaller size. When would it expand significantly?
Oh, there's a baby in there.
There's a baby.
Yeah, when a woman is pregnant, then the fetus is growing inside of the uterus. And so if you see a pregnant woman and she's far along in her pregnancy, she has an extended abdomen. What's really inside of that abdomen is her uterus has expanded to hold the fetus as it grows. So it sometimes might be called the womb. So the baby's developing in the womb. That's the uterus. The opening of the uterus, which is here in the diagram, it's called the cervix. It's basically a passageway that leads from the uterus to the vagina. We'll talk more about sort of childbirth and so forth later on. But if you've known a woman that's pregnant, or a brother or sister or niece, nephew or something like that, or in the movies, when a woman is in labor and they're talking about whether or not she's dilated, they're talking about the cervix. The cervix needs to open up to allow the baby to be born. Also, you probably have heard of the cervix. Cervical cancer is one common form of cancer that affects women. So it's when cells in the cervix sort of grow uncontrollably. That's what cancer is in general. And there's actually a virus that, if a woman is infected with this virus, it drastically increases her chances of developing cervical cancer. Okay? And it's a virus that can be transmitted sexually. The men can carry the virus as well. And it can be transmitted sexually, like another sexually transmitted disease. But in the last 10 years or so, scientists have developed a vaccine. A vaccine that prevents people from getting this virus, and probably many of you have had the vaccine. They recommend it. It's not a required vaccine for to go into school, but it's very common. Probably your pediatrician recommends it, and they give it to both boys and girls. Around your age, they would get it's called, the brand name is Gardasil. If you ever heard about that vaccine.
I was going to be like, oh.
Yeah, so that is, that's a vaccine that prevents people from getting infected with HPV. That's the name of the virus, human papillomavirus. And if we reduce the number of people that have HPV virus, then we can probably drastically reduce the incidence of cervical cancer in women. So it's a good practice to vaccinate as many people as possible. And so then the passageway where the fetus will be born eventually, the birth canal, is the vagina. It's also where sperm are deposited during sex for reproduction. And so if we look, this diagram just shows sort of everything once. So we have 2 ovaries, 2 fallopian tubes, 1 uterus, the cervix at the end, and then the vagina.
Wait, if the fallopian tubes aren't connected, how don't the ovaries just go?
The egg cells, you mean?
Yeah.
Because there are cilia inside of the fallopian tubes. They're kind of just like Hermes, and we have cilia in our body, in our trachea and stuff to help filter out things we eat. But also in a woman's body, the fallopian tubes have cilia, and basically they work to, they're saying to the egg, hey, come on in, and they paddle the egg in, and it starts traveling through that fallopian tube. So those cilia are helping that to happen. Good question. So if we look at this diagram, we can label all the parts. Raise your hand without going back. What should I put at this arrow?
Ovary.
Raise your hand.
Ovary.
Jake? Yeah, ovary. Somebody else, raise your hand. Then I'll call your name. Then you'll give me an answer. Colin?
Which one?
This one.
Fallopian tube.
Fallopian tube. Also called oviduct.
That one sounds way less weird.
Oviduct meaning egg, and duct means like a tube. How about this one?
I don't know that. No, sure.
Lily?
Uterus.
Uterus?
Oh. I thought it was at the top.
Sia?
Cervix.
Cervix? Some brave soul? Yes.
Why did you have to say
Vagina.
that?
Thank you, Jack. Yes, that is the vagina.
Yeah, it's so
Very brave of you, Jack. Thanks for contributing.
No problem, anytime.
All right, so we talked about, so did we define the word gamete? Okay, so gamete is just another word for a sex cell, a specialized cell that can combine in reproduction to form an offspring. So that's a general term, saying gamete or sex cell. And in females, the sex cell, the gamete, is the egg cell. In males, the gamete is the sperm cell. They're produced in the ovaries. And there's only about 400 or so in the ovary. And they're present from birth. And after puberty, based on a woman's reproductive cycle, the menstrual cycle, about once every month or so, one of these egg cells will mature inside of the ovary and eventually will be released into the fallopian tube. The egg cell is one of the largest cells in the body. Okay, it has a lot of cytoplasm and nucleus, sort of an outer layer that, like I said, allows only one sperm cell to enter. So that egg cell, when it is released, starts traveling through the fallopian tube. And this is actually where fertilization occurs. Sometimes people make the mistake of thinking, well, sperm cells are released into the vagina, that's around where actually the fertilization of the egg takes place. But it doesn't. The egg has to be fertilized somewhere in this fallopian tube in order for a woman to become pregnant. So what that means is sperm cells are deposited in the vagina. They have a long journey. This is why they need the nutrients, the liquid of the semen, because they have to swim their way. These tiny little microscopic cells have to swim their way from the vagina, through the cervix, through the uterus, all the way up into the top parts of the fallopian tube where they will eventually meet the egg. The egg releases chemicals so that the sperm cells sort of are attracted to the proper fallopian tube to find the egg. Not so a man can release millions of sperm cells at a single time. Not that many actually reach the egg in the oviduct, or in the fallopian tube. Only a small percent of the sperm cells get there. And so that's one of the reasons that males have to produce so many sperm cells, is because very few actually reach the egg to fertilize. So when that does happen, when a sperm cell is released, swims its way into the fallopian tube, it can eventually combine with the egg cell. We have a term for that: fertilization. So when the sperm and egg cell combine, a single sperm cell and a single egg cell, we say that fertilization has happened, and the cell that's produced, the very first cell, it's called the zygote. And so we'll talk more about this in our next unit, but the sperm cell is carrying genetic material from the father. The egg cell has genetic material from the mother. Each of them have 23 chromosomes. We all get 23 of our chromosomes from our mother, 23 from our father. Half of our DNA comes from each parent.
I got that one.
And that's always the case. Even if you look identical to one parent or the other, you still have half of your gene, half of your chromosomes from each parent. And so after that zygote is formed, it continues to travel down the fallopian tube. But while it's traveling, it's starting to divide. It starts as a zygote, a single cell, But then that cell goes through a process called mitosis
I heard
to
it.
form two cells. And then those two cells go through mitosis again and form 4 cells, and 8 and 16. And so this single zygote starts to develop into a little cluster of cells that we call the embryo. And so this embryo travels down the fallopian tube, growing. Some changes happen to it. It starts to become a hollow ball of cells. It starts to get an indentation. Layers start to form. And so this process is the development of the embryo. Those cells are going to eventually become different parts of the body, different tissues, and so forth. So this cell division is happening as the zygote, as the embryo is making its way through the fallopian tube. The cilia are guiding it along the way. If that egg that was released was fertilized, it goes into the uterus and it attaches to the wall of the uterus, to the uterine lining. The lining of the uterus has been prepared for this. It thickens. Blood vessels start to form so that it can form a placenta to give nutrients and oxygen to the fetus. Okay? And it's going to stay attached to the wall of the uterus throughout all of pregnancy until birth. Now, most of the time, the egg's released during ovulation, but it's not fertilized. The egg's not fertilized. Again, it continues its pathway through the fallopian tube, but because it wasn't fertilized, it never divides into 2 cells and 4. It just stays that single egg cell. And because that egg cell wasn't fertilized, it doesn't implant into the wall of the uterus. And therefore, this lining that has been thickening and getting ready for a pregnancy is no longer needed because the egg wasn't fertilized. And so as part of the reproductive cycle in a woman, that's what the menstrual period is. So the lining of the uterus starts to break away. The egg cell and that lining are shed, and that's what the menstrual period is. Basically, these things break down, disintegrate, they leave the body through the vagina, and that's the period. And so then what happens after that?
Another egg comes
Another, the process repeats. Another egg starts to develop in the ovary. It's released. The lining of the uterus starts to thicken again. The egg cell's not fertilized. Everything breaks down. It's shed during the menstrual period. And so this repeats. What's one of the signs that a woman might realize she's pregnant? Like, what's something that tells her that?
Miss your
Addis?
period.
She doesn't have a period.
Yeah, she doesn't get her period. And so that should make sense. Why? Because that embryo is now implanted in the lining of the uterus, it's not going to be shed anymore. It's going to stay thickened because the embryo is growing there. It's going to develop into the fetus. And so her period stops. And her period won't come back until she actually gives birth. And even sometimes for a while after that, the reproductive cycle doesn't restart. There's several hormones that regulate a woman's reproductive cycle. There's estrogen, there's progesterone, there's FH, LSH. These hormone levels go up and down throughout the reproductive cycle, causing these various events to happen, causing ovulation, causing the lining of the uterus to thicken, and so forth.
Like, say the sperm cells are going through the woman's uterus, but they can't reach that egg cell. What happens to the sperm cells after? Like, if
Nothing, they just sort of break down. Yeah, they just they eventually die. Just break down, decompose. So this diagram kind of shows the stages, and so we'll look at from the very beginning. So what we would start here. So these are these very tiny, immature egg cells that are present from birth. Once puberty comes, every 28 days or so, one of them starts to mature and develop. It forms inside of a little bubble called the follicle inside of the ovary. And that follicle makes its way to the edge of the ovary and then breaks open, releasing the small egg cell inside into the fallopian tube. So that stage is called ovulation. A woman is ovulating about halfway through her typical reproductive cycle. So that egg cell starts traveling down the fallopian tube. Here is where it can be fertilized. So this is a tiny sperm cell. It's hard to see in this diagram, but this egg has now been fertilized. So we call this cell that's been fertilized a zygote. It then goes through its cell divisions. Now it's 2 cells, and then 4, and 8, and so forth. Eventually makes its way into the uterus, attaches to the lining, which has been thickened, preparing for this, and then we would say that the woman's pregnant. Okay, the embryo has implanted. All right, this is like the side view of the female reproductive system, just a different way of showing things. So again, we have the ovary up here. It's not showing you both of them because this is like a side view, it only shows one.
Oh, so this lady's chopped in half.
Yeah, it's like a cross section. So fallopian tube, uterus, cervix, vagina, and then some other, so these are not parts of the reproductive system, these are parts of other systems, but they're in the vicinity. So we'll just show you where they are. This is the bladder. So again, if you've known a woman that's been far along in her pregnancy, she may complain she has to go to the bathroom all the time, and the reason is because as the fetus grows inside of this uterus, the bladder is right in front of it, and therefore the fetus can put pressure on it, can compact the bladder, so it can't hold as much urine. So that might be why a woman has to pee a lot when she's pregnant. The urethra. The pubic bone is a part of the pelvic bones. And the rectum behind the uterus. So in comparing the two, go ahead and, without looking at your top slide, see if you can label these 2 pictures. Again, this will be something you definitely will have to do on your quiz next week. You guys are pretty good from your quiz at labeling things, except for one. And I'll tell you about that later.
Question about it. Hopefully you label the right parts in the right diagram. That's
step one, knowing which is which.
Oh.
All right. It's okay. That's what we're learning. So testes, scrotum,
Yes.
vas
Oh,
deferens.
that's what that one was. Yeah, I couldn't tell if that was more.
So the prostate gland is here, the seminal vesicle, the urethra, or you might have labeled penis. Either one.
I said pee.
Ovary. So the ovaries, you may have noticed here, they are connected by a strand of tissue
Yeah,
to
this
the
one.
outside of the uterus, right here and right here. But that's not where the eggs go. The eggs go through the fallopian tube. That just holds the ovaries sort of in place. So we have the fallopian tube, the ovary, fallopian tube, uterus, out of order, but cervix, and then vagina. No problem?
Hold on.
Fluid
Oh,
problem.
we're going back.
Check. Check. I think.
I think we're gonna
Oh, quick, sound
pause here, and I'm gonna give you back. Yeah, we could talk about the rest tomorrow. We're gonna. I'm gonna give back your quizzes that I have since now everyone's taking them.